Hello class, welcome back to part 2 for writing assignment 8, composing an argument based on a definition. And as I said in the last video, let me just remind you of the importance of philosophical counseling on page 60, which urges people to use critical thinking skills to better understand personal problems. And I think that we can apply those critical thinking skills to our understanding of the abstractness of these terms. So picking up where we left off, perhaps the most easily tackled, if you would, topic on this list would be identity. You could pretty much do a character analysis under the idea of identity to make a point about identity. You might look at female identity or LGBTQIA identity and the stereotypes that surround it. You might want to look at homoeroticism and Hamlet if you watch the Hamlet videos. The last one, if you remember, kind of point out how at the ending of the play, maybe Hamlet and Horatio, there's a little bit something more there. Lady Macbeth unsexes herself, right? What does she say? Come to me, you spirits depend on mortal thoughts. Unsex me here and now. Fill me from the crown to the toe top full of direst cruelty. Make thick my blood. Right? Sorry, I love Lady Macbeth. She's just such a badass, though. I mean, never before have we seen a female character, right? Um, this ruthless. At that time, I don't think there's one in literature prior. Um, so how does she transcend? I mean, why does she have to unsex herself to be vicious and powerful? Why can't she be female and right and do that? So remember, the witches are essentially transgender characters, and Lady Macbeth herself becomes a transgender character. And remember, Macbeth says he does it all for her approval. So are we kind of witnessing a transgender relationship? Um, Again, identity. I think both Hamlet and Macbeth, as are all fictional sources, characters and speakers of poems, are ripe for an identity analysis. So again, what's difficult to understand about identity? Everything, right? I mean, the whole abstract idea, what makes these terms abstract? What makes identity abstract? Everything. Again, you want to look at racial stereotyping, racial identity. For those of you who've already read Othello, if you want to look ahead, again, I don't have a problem if you compare and contrast your characters in fiction with present day examples, but do not make the paper a paper on nonfiction, right? You can compare and contrast your characters from fiction with present or modern or real life examples, but make sure the focus of the paper is the literary analysis, because again, we're writing about literature in this class. So that being said, law. Okay, the law is supposed to be a good thing, right? Just like a leader, just like politician, right? So when does the law become abstract? When it's not applied logically. Are there instances where characters in literature, just like people in real life, break the law and get away with it when they're not supposed to? Yes. Look at Claudius. Look at Macbeth. Initially, they're not caught. Hamlet, he kills Polonius and gets away with it because he's the prince. Are these characters in positions of power getting away with it? Macbeth, Claudius, Hamlet, because of that power? Is it also because of their masculine identity as well? Again, you can look at law from a different perspective, but I think that that speech again, where Claudius is kneeling, right, and he says, can I be? May one be pardoned and retain the offense? Meaning, can you be forgiven for doing something wrong and keep all the stuff? Right? I mean, think about it. In our law, right? Let's say I rob a liquor store, right? And I go to court. They're going to say, well, number one, give the money back. And number two, now you have to do like an act of contrition or penance, whether it's serve a jail sentence or, I guess maybe that's a bad example. Let's go with the religious idea. You rob a liquor store and you go talk to a priest, right? And what does the priest say? And I mean, that wasn't a bad example, but what we're thinking about here is, my whole point is, the idea is, if you do something wrong and you want to be forgiven, can you be forgiven but keep all the stuff that you got by doing something wrong? And if you go to ask for forgiveness from a priest in a confessional, which is what Claudius is essentially, he's praying to God and he's asking for forgiveness, you have to A, be sorry, B, give the stuff back, and then do an act of contrition. He's not sorry. He doesn't want to stop being king and being stopped married to Gertrude, and he doesn't want to do an act of contrition. So he realizes, may one be pardoned and retain the offense, right? And he realizes that in the religious world, in God's eyes, no, it doesn't work like that. But remember what he says. In the corrupted currents of this world, offence's gilded hand may shove by justice, and often the wicked prize itself buys out the law. 'Tis not so above. There is no shuffling. Right? He realizes that offense's gilded hand may shove by justice. Right? People use the money that they got from doing bad things to pay their way out of trouble. We see it in modern times too. So are certain characters able to transcend or break the laws? Yes. Well, then that makes the law abstract if it's not unilaterally applied and logically applied. Leader, right? Just like heroism. Uh, Same with kind of politician. They're very similar. They're supposed to do what's best for the people. You could look at Claudius as an illogical leader, as his hubris fuels his decision making process. He's very selfish. Same with Macbeth. You could look at Duncan as an example of a good leader and compare and contrast Duncan and Macbeth. Why? He rewards his people. He takes care of them. But wait a minute. Uh-oh. Is he too nice? Remember, Duncan, as he realizes Macbeth has saved the day in the very beginning of the play, he says, "My plenteous joys hide themselves in drops of sorrow." He's crying because he's so happy. Now, again, I think it's a good thing to show one's emotions. However, as a leader, does that make you vulnerable? What does Lady Macbeth say about Macbeth when she's reading the letter to us in that moment of omniscience? She says, "Thou art not without ambition," right? Just he lacks the meanness to attend it. I'm messing up the quote right now. Forgive me. But if you go back to that letter, she's saying you're ambitious. But he lacks the illness to attend it, meaning he doesn't have that mean streak. Again, are there illogical heroes, leaders, and politicians out there that do not make logical decisions to benefit the people and instead, let their hubris, their arrogance fuel their decision-making process, much like Macbeth, much like Claudius? Absolutely. Maturity. Is maturity just a synonym for critical thinking, for logos, right? When someone makes an immature decision, it's usually because they're letting pathos overtake logos. They're letting their emotions fuel their decision making process. And if their emotions are fueled by arrogance or hubris, right, would we then call them immature? Again, I think you could look at maturity from a critical thinking standpoint, and that becomes an abstract term. Political correctness. Where do I begin? I don't even know where to begin, how to define that. I mean, that's very, very abstract. And I mean, does political correctness involve obfuscation? Does it involve euphemisms, right? That blur the meanings of things? Again, remember denotation, connotation, obfuscation, and euphemism for this paper, in addition to using Occam's razor, engaging in the dialectic, looking for hidden or irrational assumptions, um, uh, uh, using Rogerian strategy. Again, all of these critical thinking strategies, you can use them and apply them to your analysis of the decision making process of characters and speakers in stories, poems, and plays to better understand these abstract terms and to make your point, to extend the definition of the word, right? To include your meaning and your perspective. I think you already touched on politician. Let's skip pornography for now. Well, okay, no, we won't. Let's just get right to it. The few papers that I've got on pornography, a lot of times people try to redefine what is considered pornographic because technically pornography has a negative connotation. I've got papers writing about how pornography can be therapeutic, but again, now what sources are you going to cite? I mean, again, you got to keep it, PG here. You can't be citing dirty things. But could you maybe use 50 Shades of Grey as a source to redefine what is considered pornographic? I've gotten papers on that. Just don't do the movie. You got to read the book. And again, for this, it's very obvious when people just take a couple quotes from Goodreads and they didn't actually read the book and instead they're writing about the movie. It's obvious. It's obvious in a 200 level class. So pick something you've read. Don't make your life difficult and choose a novel that you haven't read that you want to write about. Pick something that you've read. When you go back to the famous poets and poems websites, right, when you typed in top 50 poems, remember they have poems by subject there. Poems about, literally, if you click on poems about sex, there's literally a subject there. So again, you could redefine pornography. I believe there's a novel, The Pornographer's Poem, I believe is what it's called. And nevertheless, it is an abstract definition. So one of the more difficult paper topics. Like I said, if you're struggling with this, choose identity and do a character analysis and make a point. About identity to go beyond just the general definition. Um, Picking things up here, progress, kind of like courage, kind of like education, normally a good thing. But do sometimes people make progress in their plans and it leads to illogical decision making? Absolutely. Macbeth makes progress in his plan, and it leads to nothing but paranoia and psychotic behavior. Hamlet makes progress logically when he's trying to find out whether or not the ghost has told him the truth about Claudius, and he uses his antic disposition logically, I think, when he's talking to Polonius, when he's talking to Claudius and Gertrude, when he's talking to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Acts 1, 2, and 3.1 and 3.2. But as we discussed as I shared with you in the lecture videos on Hamlet, from 3.3 on, um, his progress is illogical and his hubris fuels his decision making process instead of being ruled by logos. Terrorism. Normally it's an external thing, but can terrorism be more of an internal thing? Why do we only refer to it as external? Well, we put that adjective domestic terrorism now. Are there examples in literature of leaders who terrorize their people, but we don't call it terrorism? I think so. I think you could say that Macbeth, in some ways, could be described as a terrorist. Um, One of the more difficult ones. Same with the middle class. That's probably the most difficult one on this list. And last but certainly not least, torture. Now, normally the denotation of physical torture is what it is, but when does torture become abstract? Well, when we think about emotional torture or psychological torture, are there characters in stories, poems, and plays that psychologically or emotionally torture themselves or others? I think of Iago in Othello. He psychologically tortures Othello. In some ways, Lady Macbeth psychologically tortures Macbeth. Um, in some ways, you could say that Polonius's decision to tell Ophelia not to talk to Hamlet in some ways is psychologically torturing him as well. So hopefully these videos have been helpful in guiding you when choosing a topic for writing assignment 8, composing an extended definition, which will become your essay number 3. And as I've constantly alluded to throughout these videos, make sure you focus on the list on page 118 as your drafting and outlining your argument. More to come. Thanks for your patience. Stay tuned. And as always, get in touch if you have any questions.